My own acquaintanceship and work with Thomas Church goes back 25 years, almost exactly. We've considered him for a long time a kind of revolutionary in landscaping and the leader of a bringing of landscaping to the family residence, to the small house. And he was of enormous influence on architects out of this, because the outdoor living at modest domestic scale was his revolutionary achievement, and it opened up thousands, tens of thousands of houses, what could be done. That took place, led by Tommy in the 1950s. And he didn't work with very many builders, very few.
I think that Tommy has been so many different things to so many different people that you have to take a fairly broad look at his work and the way he's operated and some of the people he's worked with to get some feeling for the depth and complexity of the man. I remember one time about 15 years ago when our offices were in San Francisco around the corner from Tommy's, and Bill Johnson was in town. I remember it was a rainy day and Bill was taking some pictures in the alley. And I looked up, and this was on a Saturday morning, I looked up and Tommy's light was on in the window in that corner building. And I said, Bill, have you ever met Tommy Church? He said, no. And so I said, come on, let's go up and talk to him. So we went up, and there was Tommy designing all alone in the office. He had a wood-burning stove going, kind of a big, wasn't a Franklin stove exactly, but it was an iron sort of stove. It was right next to his chair, and he was sitting in this corner, as many of you who know him had seen him. He was looking out at the street, and he was working on someone's backyard. And we chatted. There was nothing of any particular importance that day. And then he said something which I've remembered ever since, and he said, I don't do the big kind of things you guys do. He says, I don't have an office and so forth. He says, it's really because I'm too selfish for that. He says, what I like to do is design the gardens. And he says, I like to get into them. I like to know the clients. He says, I love those ladies with the hats. And anyway, later on, we walked downstairs, and I thought to myself, well, we probably haven't done anything any larger than he has. But we probably haven't gotten as close to those people. And we certainly haven't spent as much time happily drawing and working in gardens as he has over these years.
The thing I remember about being with Tommy is that I've never met anybody in my life before or since who knew as much about the craft of their profession or their art form as Tommy. He really understood land. He really understood about how buildings get sited in land. He really understood how you put brick and mortar and stone and concrete together on a craft level and an actual doing level than anybody that I've ever worked with or known since in the profession.
We at Sunset have had a joint architectural awards program with the American Institute of Architects for 20 years. It began in 1957, and it's gone on all the years since then. We've always had a landscape architect on our awards jury, and the first jury in 1957, the landscape architect indeed was Thomas Church. On the first jury, on the top award, it was for a house by Paul Kirk of Seattle, and it was a marvelous house with a hollow core and a garden growing through it. And Tommy wrote about it so vividly that we used his words to lead off the beginning of the AIA Sunset Western Home Awards program. And these were Tommy's words. He called the Kirk house a highly civilized and attractive tree house, bringing back for a moment that nostalgic urge which we all have as small boys to live in a tree, and which is gradually stifled by a civilization that stuffs us in a box and clamps down the lid. That's Tommy Church talking, and he was indeed a marvel in expressing himself. He had a kind of a grand simplicity. He was an unfussy landscape architect. Among many other things, he was a generous man and quick to express his admiration for a good job of work. And he always had a small practice. He didn't build a great team, and he always had in part a residential practice. Tommy was in no sense in love with tradition or in love with the past. He was very much a member of the changing times. He was very much ahead of his time.
But for instance, he would go out to look at new jobs or respond to calls wearing sort of khaki work clothes, shirt, pants, and carrying a little kit of garden tools. I'm sure you've heard about this. And while he was interviewing the lady in her garden, he would prune her shrubs up into trees or her trees down into shrubs or whatever. Of course, he epitomized also what I read once that about architecture, that someone said that the successful architect is completely integrated with his clientele. And I would say that was true of Tommy. And so he knew very well what they wanted, what they needed in terms of outdoor living spaces. Those needs, which were for fairly elaborate gardens, which had a kind of social content. I remember being told that at some point in recent years that he no longer kept any books or cost records, which he had always been very meticulous about, because he was able to charge so much that it didn't matter on an hourly basis.
He was in tune with the contemporary art movement of the time. He was conversant and a friend with most of the contemporary architects of that time. And actually his contribution was that he actually was able to rise to the challenge of their work. In other words, as the house developed, it became the inside-outside sort of thing. Tommy never did things the way we do it today. He never turned out a set of working drawings in the depth that we do today. He always very, very definitely had contractors in the field that could really do the work and fill in the holes. So it was kind of an ideal situation because he was still sort of an in-the-field artist. He could spend more time in the field, and he loved to go to the country and would allocate 2 or 3 days a week for that purpose. Thomas Church had a reputation for building a maintenance-free garden. He easily understood spaces, well-built structures that would not fall down. All you had to do was keep the ivy clipped and the lawn mowed and the trees without problems. That was what his clients wanted. The more money they had, the more interested they were in the cost of maintenance. He always used large specimen plant material when his clients could afford it. He had a nice way with people. They liked what he did. They seemed to understand. And Tommy's clients became friends. The friendship between the architect and the landscape architect was very strong, and I cannot help feeling that a great deal of the success of the work came because of that relationship and the trust that the architect had in Tommy's ability.
Miss Wagner is one heck of a gardener. She stimulated him so much with her gardening abilities that he designed to her. And if it had been the same project in exactly the same location and a different client that liked something else, he would have done something entirely different. Some of his writings would verify that the basic thing the garden had to do was satisfy the client. The title of his last book, Your Private World, that connotates it's yours. One of the worst problems was when the clients wanted to rely only upon his imagination. That always seemed to be a very frustrating thing for him, that the more interested the client was in the garden or the project, the more satisfactory the thing seemed to turn out.
At the time, he didn't that much differentiate between actually building gardens and designing them. He perceived that designing a garden and actually building it were part of the same process, and that you had to spend a good deal of time on the job. And since contracting was part of the creative act for him, he was involved in contracting as well as designing. And building it means also designing in such a way that you are out in the field and stake the header boards and stake the lines on the field, in the field. And then you go out into the nursery and you buy the plant materials that are specifically designed to take their place in that composition, and then you locate them in the field yourself and you help plant them yourself. It's also true that Tommy, I don't know whether led or worked with or influenced is the right word, they all maybe are equally important, a whole generation of architects. He never saw, I think, landscape architecture as a social tool. He never took on the presumption of changing the social system of the world. And in that sense, I think he's a very great person because he values people for what they are. It's a very modern point of view. Well, talking about the Donnell Garden, many people ask about the Donnell Garden. I suppose in some ways it's unique because it did a lot of things perhaps for the first time, one of which is that it tried to deal with nature and the forms of nature which were spread out before us on this unique site of the swamplands and the curvilinear designs in the swamplands below us, which we transferred up onto the plateau and used in many of the shapes and forms of what we were designing. In addition, it took a lot of the materials from the site, rocks and stones and big boulders, and moved them around as an important part of the composition. That, too, was what I was relating to before, and that is that instead of having an abstract idea of a painterly composition, we composed the thing based on the nature of the materials there. The idea of moving the stones into the pool is the thing that you swam through, which was the original idea that I had. Tommy, more importantly, said, well, let's, instead of moving a stone inside the pool, which might not work terribly well, and you couldn't really use anyway, why don't we get Addie Kent to do a piece of sculpture that you could swim through, and that's what we did there. Donnell also tried to, as an exemplar of an early involvement, got the client, in fact, to work on the garden. The client rode the bulldozer, moved the rocks around himself, and was part of the actual day-by-day putting into the garden, which I was up there a great deal, and Tommy was too. And that is that here was an example, I remember it very distinctly, of a guy, a wealthy rancher, who spent a good deal of his time actually helping build the garden. Now, the compositional devices, I think, which a lot of people talk of, seem less important to me. The question of whether the pool is or isn't curvilinear is, I think, less important, but on the other hand, perhaps part of that whole idea, and that is that we were trying to, instead of imposing something that was rectilinear and self-contained and like an Italian garden, which utilizes the landscape but makes it very man-made. Here we were trying to use some of the many forms of nature itself and distribute them in a way that, not that you wouldn't know that it was man-made, but that it felt comfortable there.
I think if you go back through the ASLA books of completed work back in 1936 or 25 or back in those days, you'll probably find a lot of large estates back east in Chicago and even here in California that had very elegant terraces, views, large French windows that opened onto the terraces. And there actually was an indoor-outdoor living kind of thing that was going on. In that respect, indoor-outdoor living, as we've heard about it, is not a new thing. But I think it is. What is new is that same elegance of life and the use of gardens is now available to the average person. I don't mean the poor, but it is available to the lower and middle income levels through tract building and of houses that have that openness to the outside, which has become very popular, largely because of Tommy's work and the work of the landscape architects in the Bay Area through the 50s and 60s. And Tommy, I think, can be credited with developing that concept of bringing that kind of living in a very practical way down to the average person's level. If anyone can be given credit for starting that concept and popularizing it and having a following during that period, which helped to make it very common, very available to everyone. Tommy is that man.